The Vreth fleet arrived on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to them, of course. The Vreth did not have Tuesdays. The Vreth did not have Mondays either, which, if you asked any human who had ever survived a Monday, seemed like a biological advantage worth envying. But they arrived on a Tuesday, right in the middle of rush hour, right when every highway on Earth was already a slow-moving disaster, and millions of humans were already furious before a single alien ship even entered the atmosphere. That right there should have been the first warning sign. The Vreth High Command monitored Earth from above for 6 full rotations before deciding to make contact. 6 days of watching, 6 days of studying, 6 days of running calculations, analyzing behavior patterns, measuring threat levels, and trying to understand exactly what kind of species they were dealing with. Their sensors recorded everything: the traffic jams, the sports riots, the cooking competitions broadcast at maximum volume, the humans arguing on something called social media about whether a specific dress was blue or gold. The Vreth analysts filed 17 separate reports about the dress argument alone. The conclusion of the 17th report was, and this is a direct translation, "We do not understand these creatures, and we are not sure we want to." Nevertheless, the Vreth were a conquering empire. They had absorbed 231 civilizations across 4 galaxies. They had a process, they had protocols, they had a very official-looking invasion manual that had never once failed them, and they were not about to let one confusing species ruin a perfect record. Grand Admiral Vorro-Kain stood at the command deck of the flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and looked down at the blue-green planet through the observation glass. He was tall, even by Vreth standards. His forearms were folded across his chest in the posture that his subordinates had learned to associate with either deep thought or mild indigestion. His skin was the pale grey of old stone, and his eyes were the colour of something that had never seen sunlight and was proud of it. "Run the standard assessment again," he said. His intelligence officer, a smaller Vreth named Dos Pell, pulled up the holographic display with practiced efficiency. Planetary population, approximately 8 billion. Technological classification, Type 0, approaching Type 1. Military capability, he paused here, and something in his posture shifted, just slightly, fragmented, but significant. "They do not have a unified planetary military, sir. Each nation-state maintains its own forces." Vorro-Kain tilted his head. "No unified defense?" "No, sir. They fight each other." "Frequently, sir." Almost enthusiastically. There was a silence on the command deck. Several officers exchanged glances. One of them, a young communications specialist named Yeel, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and then immediately looked at the floor. Vorro-Kain allowed himself a thin smile. "Then this will be straightforward. Open a channel to their planetary leaders. Inform them that the Vreth Dominion demands unconditional surrender within 48 of their hours, or we begin orbital bombardment of their population centers." Dos Pell hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a flicker, but Vorro-Kain noticed it because he noticed everything. "Speak," the Admiral said. "Sir, the analysts have flagged something in the behavioral data, something that does not fit the standard profile." "What kind of something?" Dos Pell pulled up a secondary file. "Over the past 6 days of observation, we've recorded 412 separate incidents of humans reacting to immediate life-threatening danger with..." Laughter. Another silence. Longer this time. "Laughter," Vorro-Kain repeated. "Yes, sir. And in 290 of those 412 incidents, the laughter came before the threat was resolved. Not after. Before." Vorro-Kain stared at the display for a moment. Then he waved his hand. "Send the message." The message was sent. The response came back in under 3 hours, which was, by Vreth standards, extremely fast. Most civilizations took the full 48 hours, if they responded at all. Several had simply started praying. One species, the Dalhari of the Seron system, had responded by sending a gift basket, which the Vreth had found confusing and ultimately irrelevant. The humans responded in 3 hours with a video feed. On the screen appeared a man in a military uniform. He was not young. He had the kind of face that suggested it had been through several conversations that none of the other faces involved had enjoyed. His name, according to the translation data, was General Marcus Webb, Supreme Commander of the Emergency Coalition Defense Force, a title that had been created approximately 2 hours earlier, specifically for this occasion. He looked directly into the camera. He looked, specifically, directly into the camera at the alien fleet sitting above his planet, and he said no, just that. No explanation, no negotiation, no counter-offer, just no delivered with the energy of a man who had already had this argument before and had already won it, and was mildly annoyed to be having it again. Vorro-Kain stared at the screen for a long moment. Did they just say no? Yes, sir. No context? No demands? No counter-proposal? No, sir. Just no. Yiel, the communications specialist, was definitely not laughing. He was looking at the floor with a very serious expression, and his shoulders were completely still. Vorro-Kain straightened. Then we demonstrate our firepower, target one of their uninhabited zones, fire a single orbital strike, let them see what we are capable of. The strike hit a stretch of empty desert in what the humans called the Atacama region. The explosion was, by any reasonable standard, absolutely enormous. It turned several square kilometers of rock and sand into glass. It sent a shockwave that knocked birds out of the sky 300 kilometers away. It left a crater that would be visible from orbit for the next several thousand years. The humans watched it happen on their global broadcast networks. And then 17 seconds after the explosion cleared, a human news network cut to a reporter standing at the edge of the blast zone, already on location, with a microphone saying, "Incredible scenes here, as we witness what can only be described as the single most dramatic geological event in recorded history. We're going to try to get closer, stay with us." Dospel turned to look at the Admiral very slowly. "They're trying to get closer," he said. "I see that," said Vorro-Kain. "To the thing that just vaporized several square kilometers of planetary surface. I can see that, Dospel. For a news broadcast. I am watching it happen in real time. I am aware." The reporter on screen was now speaking to someone off camera, gesturing enthusiastically at the smoking crater, and appeared to be smiling. Grand Admiral Vorro-Kain of the Vreth Dominion, conqueror of 231 civilizations, looked at the image on his screen for a very long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "What is wrong with these creatures?" No one answered. Mostly because no one had an answer, but also because Yiel had finally made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, and the entire command deck had gone very quiet in the way that things go quiet when everyone is trying very hard not to join in. The Vreth gave the humans another 24 hours. During those 24 hours, the humans did not surrender. What the humans did instead was organize. The Emergency Coalition Defense Force, which had been 2 hours old when General Webb made his video response, had spent the following 26 hours growing into something considerably more substantial. Every nation that had been arguing with every other nation 24 hours earlier was now, with truly remarkable speed, agreeing on things. Supply lines were established, equipment was moved, personnel were assigned, and somewhere, in a series of locations that the Vreth observation satellites could not quite pin down, something else was happening. The Vrethan sensors kept catching fragments of it, communications bursts, movement patterns that didn't match any standard military deployment. Small groups of humans moving into positions that made no tactical sense by Vreth analysis. Civilians who weren't in uniform, weren't part of any registered military unit, and weren't doing anything that the Vreth could classify as either retreat or surrender. "What are those units?" Vorro-Kain asked, watching the data. "We're not entirely sure, sir," Dospel said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something careful. "They don't appear to be military personnel, no uniforms, no unit designations we can identify, but they're moving with purpose. Into what positions? That's the part we can't explain, sir. They're spreading out, not concentrating. Every high point within observation range of our likely landing zones, every long sight line, every elevated position." Vorro-Kain looked at his intelligence officer. "Are you telling me they're positioning snipers?" Dospel looked at the data. Then he looked at the Admiral. "I'm telling you we don't know what they're positioning, sir, because we can't identify them as military." There was a pause. "Then find out," Vorro-Kain said. "Hail General Webb again. It's time we talked." The channel opened in minutes. Webb appeared on screen again. Same uniform, same expression, same energy of a man who had decided several decades ago that being annoyed was simply his default state and had made his peace with it. "General Webb," Vorro-Kain said, "I will offer you one final opportunity. Lay down your arms, and your people will be spared the worst of what follows." Webb looked at him through the screen. "What follows?" he repeated, in a tone that suggested he was testing the phrase for flavor and finding it somewhat lacking. "You cannot win this conflict. You have no space-based weapons. You have no unified command capable of resisting our ground forces once we deploy. And when we deploy, we will deploy in numbers your planetary defense cannot match." Webb was quiet for a moment. He glanced at something off-screen, then he looked back. "I want to ask you something," he said. Vorro-Kain tilted his head. "Ask. How many civilizations have you conquered?" 231. "And how many of them fought back?" Vorro-Kain paused. "Several. They were managed." "How many of them laughed at your opening shot?" The command deck went very, very quiet. Webb didn't smile. He had the kind of face that didn't waste smiles on moments that didn't earn them. "We're going to fight," he said. "I just wanted you to understand something before you land your troops. You asked for our military. You're going to get something broader than that. Every person on this planet who can hold a position, read a sightline, and stay calm under pressure has been doing this their whole lives, not because we trained them, because this is just what we do." He leaned forward slightly. "When your troops land, Admiral, I'd strongly suggest you keep your heads down." The channel closed. Vorro-Kain stood at his console for a long moment. Then he turned to Dospel. "Those unidentified units," he said. "The ones in the elevated positions, the civilians." "Yes, sir." "What exactly are they carrying?" Dospel pulled up the sensor data, enhanced it, ran it through the analysis filter, and then looked at the results for a moment before answering. "Rifles, sir," he said quietly. "Long rifles, the kind designed for extended range engagement." Vorro-Kain looked at the planet below. "How many?" Dospel checked the data again, checked it twice, looked up. "We've identified over 40,000 confirmed positions, sir, and those are only the ones our sensors can see." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a very large, very powerful entity suddenly realizes that the thing it stepped toward might have teeth considerably longer than expected. Vorro-Kain looked at the blue-green planet. He looked at the scattered light of 40,000 positions spread across the landscape like stars that had decided to come down and wait. And somewhere far below, in a command post that smelled like burnt coffee and old maps, General Marcus Webb poured himself a cup of something that was definitely not good for him, looked at the 47 other generals, commanders, and notably 3 hunters, 2 competitive shooters, and 1 retired farmer who had simply shown up and been given a radio and said exactly nothing. Because nothing needed to be said. The sky above them was full of ships, and every single one of those ships was about to learn something that 231 other civilizations had never had the misfortune of discovering. Humans as a species did not frighten easily, and the ones who didn't frighten easily had spent a very long time getting very, very good at being patient. The Vreth landing began at 0400 hours, not because 0400 was a tactically significant time by Vreth standards, but because their calculations had determined that most Earth creatures slept during the dark hours, and sleeping creatures were easier to overwhelm. It was, by every metric in the Vreth invasion manual, the correct call. It had worked on 47 different planets. It had worked against species with faster reflexes, stronger biology, and considerably better technology than the humans possessed. What the Vreth invasion manual had never accounted for was a species that had, for thousands of years, voluntarily woken up before dawn to go sit in the cold and wait for something to walk into their sights. The first dropship touched down in a wide valley outside a mid-sized city called Ralton. The ramp dropped. Vreth combat units moved out in formation, exactly as trained, exactly as the manual prescribed. 60 soldiers, full armor, weapons charged, moving in a textbook deployment spread. The valley was quiet. It was in fact so quiet that the unit commander, a Vreth officer named Gord Vell, raised his fist to halt the column and stood very still for a moment, listening. Nothing, just wind, just the sound of the ships behind him, just the dark. "Clear," he said into his communicator. "Advance." The column moved forward. 200 meters later, the first shot came. It came from a ridge that was, by the Vreth sensor team's later admission, 940 meters away. It came in complete silence, from a position that had shown no heat signature, no movement, and no electromagnetic output that any of their equipment had been able to detect. It hit the targeting module on Gord Vell's second-in-command's weapon with a precision that, under any other circumstances, might have been called artistic. The column stopped. Gord Vell spun. His sensors swept the ridge. Nothing. Empty rock. Dark sky. Wind. Then the communicator crackled, and a voice came through on the open channel. A human voice, calm, unhurried, carrying the specific tone of someone who was comfortable. "You're in the open," the voice said. "I'd move if I were you." Gordvell looked at the ridge. He looked at his formation. He looked at the targeting module that had been removed from his officer's weapon with a single shot from nearly a kilometer away, in the dark, without any visible preparation. He moved. He moved very quickly, in fact, because the second shot came 18 seconds later and took out the communications antenna on the dropship behind him, and the third shot, 4 seconds after that, hit the sensor array on the dropship's roof with an accuracy that his onboard computer flagged as statistically improbable. Back on the Eternal Dominion, Dos Pell was watching the sensor feeds with an expression that was doing complicated things. "Sir," he said. "I see it," Vorro-Kain said. "They're not targeting the soldiers, sir." "I know. They're targeting the equipment." "I know, Dos Pell. Specifically the communications equipment, and the sensors, and the targeting systems." Dos Pell paused. "Sir, they're not trying to kill our soldiers, they're trying to blind them." Vorro-Kain looked at the tactical display. Across 14 different landing zones, across 14 different terrain types, in darkness, at ranges that his analysts kept flagging as outside the theoretical limit of the weapons being used, the same thing was happening. Piece by piece, system by system, the ground units were being stripped of their ability to see, communicate, and aim. Nobody was dying. Not yet. But 14 landing columns had gone from fully operational combat units to confused clusters of soldiers standing in the dark with no sensors, no communications, and a growing awareness that there was something on every ridge, every tree line, and every elevated position that could, at any moment, decide to aim at something other than equipment. The psychological weight of that, it turned out, was considerable. Vorro-Kain pressed his communicator. "Gordvell, report." "Static, because the communications relay had been taken out 11 minutes ago. Get me any ground unit," he said to Dos Pell. Dos Pell tried, and tried again. One by one he cycled through the ground channels, and one by one they came back as either static or, in 3 cases, a human voice calmly informing him that this frequency was now occupied. One of the human voices said pleasantly, "Hi there, long range." Dos Pell stared at his console. "Sir," he said very carefully, "I think they've taken our ground communications." "I gathered that, by shooting the relay nodes." "Yes, from positions we cannot locate." Dos Pell, "Sir, stop telling me things I can already see and tell me something I can use." There was a pause. Then Dos Pell pulled up a different display, one that had been running quietly in the background for the past hour. It showed the positions of the unidentified units, the ones that had been spreading across every elevated point within range of the landing zones before the drop began. There were more of them now, not slightly more, significantly more. The original 40,000 positions had been joined by others, new positions, identified as the night went on, appearing at ranges and in locations that the Vreth deployment teams had not been watching because they had not seemed like military positions. Because they were not military positions, they were backyards, they were rooftops, they were the tops of grain silos and water towers, and in one case that Dos Pell had to zoom in on 3 times before he believed the sensor data, the roof of something the translation matrix identified as a livestock storage facility. "How many total now?" Vorro-Kain asked. Dos Pell looked at the number, looked at it again. 87,000 confirmed, sir. And I want to be very clear that confirmed means confirmed. The actual number is likely higher. Vorro-Kain looked at the display for a long time. Then he opened a channel to General Webb. Webb answered immediately. He was sitting in the same command post, same burnt coffee smell, same map-covered walls. He looked like a man who had not slept and had decided that sleep was someone else's problem. "Admiral," he said. "General." Vorro-Kain kept his voice level. He had not kept his voice this carefully level in a very long time. "I want to understand something." "Go ahead. You're military. You're official, registered, uniformed military. How many personnel?" Webb tilted his head slightly. "Combined global force, somewhere around 27 million active duty, depending on how you count reserves. And the others, the ones on the ridges and the rooftops." Webb looked at him through the screen. "Which ones specifically?" "The ones who have been systematically disabling my ground units for the past 4 hours without taking a single casualty on either side." Webb picked up his coffee. He did not drink it, he just held it. "Those aren't military, Admiral." "I know they aren't military. Those are people who own rifles." Silence. "How many people on your planet own rifles, General?" Webb set down his coffee. Globally, somewhere around 1 billion, give or take, though I'd be careful about the give or take part. The numbers are a little fuzzy because a lot of them didn't exactly register. Vorro-Kain did not move for a full 15 seconds. On the command deck, nobody breathed. Yil, the communications specialist, had stopped looking at the floor and was now looking at the Admiral with an expression that had traveled a very long distance from amusement. 1 billion. 1 billion humans, on a planet that had never unified its military, never built a space program designed for warfare, never developed weapons that could reach the Vreth fleet above them. 1 billion humans who had simply, quietly, over thousands of years, gotten very good at the specific skill of placing a projectile at a precise location from a precise distance in whatever conditions the world decided to throw at them. Not because they had been ordered to, not because a government had trained them, because they had wanted to. General, Vorro-Kain said, and his voice had taken on a quality that his officers had never heard from him before, something that was trying very hard not to sound like what it was. I need to ask you a question, a direct question. Ask it. If I land the full force, not the advance units, the full ground deployment, everything we have. Webb waited. Who am I fighting? The military? Or everyone? Webb looked at him through the screen for a long moment. Then he turned his head slightly and spoke to someone off camera. The voice that answered was quiet, but the translation matrix caught it. It was one of the hunters, or possibly the retired farmer. The audio quality made it difficult to be certain. Webb turned back. Pick any civilian, he said. They don't mind. The silence that followed was the longest silence in Vreth recorded history. Not because nothing was being said, but because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everyone in the room on both sides of the screen understood exactly what it meant. It meant that the invasion manual, the one that had worked on 231 civilizations, the one that had never once failed, did not have a chapter for this. It did not have a chapter for a species that had spent its entire existence arguing with itself, fighting with itself, dividing itself into hundreds of separate nations and factions and groups, and had somehow, through all of that, managed to distribute the skill of precise, patient, long-range engagement across 1 billion of its people so thoroughly that it wasn't even a military asset anymore. It was just a hobby. Vorro-Kain looked at the tactical display one more time. 87,000 confirmed positions, each one manned by someone who had woken up before dawn and sat in the cold and waited, not because they were ordered to, but because this was just a thing they did. Each one capable of stripping his ground forces of their ability to function without ever giving his sensors a clear target to return fire on. Each one backed by, statistically, 11 more like them somewhere that his sensors hadn't found yet. He thought about the reporter who had walked toward the crater. He thought about the dress argument. He thought about the 412 incidents of humans laughing at mortal danger before the danger was resolved. He thought about the species that had looked at his opening shot, a weapon capable of leveling a city, and sent a journalist toward it with a microphone. Then he turned to Dos Pel. Draft a communication to the Council, he said. Flag it as priority 1. Dos Pel's hand paused over the console. What should the communication say, sir? Vorro-Kain looked at the blue-green planet one more time, at the lights of its cities, at the scatter of positions across its ridges and rooftops and grain silos, at the 8 billion creatures below who had responded to the arrival of the most powerful conquering fleet in 4 galaxies by saying no, sending a journalist to the explosion, and spending the night quietly making sure that everything that could see and communicate was no longer seeing or communicating. Tell them, he said slowly, that we have encountered an anomaly. Tell them the standard assessment does not apply. Tell them the species is non-compliant in ways the manual does not cover. He paused. And tell them that the Vreth Dominion is, effective immediately, requesting a diplomatic contact rather than a military resolution. Dos Pel blinked. Sir, we have never requested diplomatic contact during an active deployment. I am aware of that. The Council will want an explanation. Tell them the explanation is that we are not equipped for this particular engagement, and that any civilization capable of fielding 1 billion unregistered long-range assets as a casual civilian activity is a civilization that would be significantly more valuable as a trading partner than as a conquered territory. He straightened his forearms. Also tell them, he added, that the humans have already taken our ground communications, so if we wait much longer, this conversation will be academic anyway. Dos Pel looked at his admiral for a moment. Then he started typing. Down below in the command post that smelled like burnt coffee and old maps, General Marcus Webb watched the Vreth dropships begin to lift off, one by one, retreating back toward the fleet in the quiet pre-dawn dark. He watched the feeds from the ridge positions and the rooftops and the grain silos. He watched 87,000 confirmed positions begin to stand down. He picked up his communicator. "All units," he said, "hold positions. They're pulling back, not retreating. Stay sharp." He set it down. The retired farmer, whose name was Dale Okoye, and who had driven 4 hours to be here and had not been asked to leave once he arrived because nobody had wanted to have that conversation, poured himself a coffee and looked at the ceiling. "Think they'll be back?" he asked. Webb considered it. "Probably." Dale nodded. "Good," he said. "I was starting to get bored." Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in what felt like a very long Tuesday, General Marcus Webb smiled. Above them, the Vreth fleet held its position, 232 conquests on its record, and one conversation it was going to be telling very, very carefully for the next several centuries. The sun came up over Ralton. The valley was quiet, and somewhere on a ridge, 940 meters from where the first dropship had landed, a human who had never worn a uniform, who had no rank and no orders and no unit designation, packed up a long rifle, stood, stretched, and walked back to a truck that had a thermos of coffee in the front seat and a dog asleep in the back. The dog didn't even wake up. It had heard the shots earlier, of course. It just hadn't been concerned.